Misha lay motionless in the farthest corner of her enclosure, her massive frame curled into itself like a shadow shrinking from the world. The once mighty bear, a legend in the sanctuary, hadn't eaten in days. Keepers whispered in hushed voices outside her pen, their concern growing with each untouched meal. Ellie stood by the fence, gripping the metal bars until her knuckles turned white. The 25-year-old caretaker had seen sick animals before. Injured owls, malnourished wolves, even a cougar on the brink of starvation. But this was different. This wasn't sickness. This was surrender. "Come on, girl," Ellie murmured, holding a piece of fresh salmon on the end of a long stick. The scent of fish should have made the old bear stir, at least glance in her direction, but Misha didn't move. Her deep brown eyes, once filled with fire and mischief, were dull and unfocused. Ellie sighed, stepping back as another keeper approached. Martin, a senior staff member in his 50s, crossed his arms as he watched the unmoving bear. "Still nothing?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "She hasn't eaten in almost a week. He barely drinks water. If this keeps up." She hesitated, unable to say the words aloud. Martin exhaled slowly, rubbing his beard. "She's old, Ellie. 59 is ancient for a bear. Maybe she's just tired." Ellie clenched her jaw. She knew Misha was old, but this wasn't just old age creeping in. This was something else, something deeper. The bear had spent years ruling this sanctuary, commanding respect even from the younger bears. Now she had given up. But why? She was fine last month, Ellie argued. Still moving, still eating. Then all of a sudden, this. Martin glanced at Misha with sad eyes. Sometimes when animals know their time is near, they just stop. They don't fight it. Ellie refused to believe that. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the trees, she sat cross-legged outside Misha's pen, watching the old bear breathe. The rise and fall of her chest was slow but steady. A quiet rhythm. Ellie had read about cases like this. Older animals losing the will to live after a sudden shift in their environment. She racked her brain for anything that had changed. The weather. No. Her diet. No. The other bears. Then a thought struck her. Misha had always been a solitary bear, preferring the company of humans over other animals. And there was one human she had always gravitated to, an old ranger who had been with the sanctuary in its early years. Ellie had seen his name on a plaque near the entrance. Henry Wallace. Ellie frowned. She had never met Henry, but she had heard stories. He was the one who had rescued Misha from a miserable life in captivity decades ago. He had been the one to teach her how to trust, to survive. Then he had left. Retired, moved away. Had Misha been waiting for him all this time? Had she finally lost hope? The idea made Ellie's stomach twist. She glanced at Misha again, her massive body still curled inward, her ears flicking slightly at the sound of birds overhead. Ellie wasn't sure if she believed in soul connections between humans and animals, but if there was even a chance that Misha was holding on for someone she had lost, Ellie had to try. She stood up, brushing dirt from her jeans. "I'm going to find him," she whispered, her heart pounding with determination. Misha didn't react, but Ellie wasn't giving up on her. Not yet. Ellie sat at her desk in the small staff office, her laptop open and her fingers tapping anxiously against the keyboard. The dim glow of the screen cast a bluish hue over her face as she searched for any trace of Henry Wallace. She had asked Martin about him earlier, but all he could offer was a shrug. "Henry retired years ago. Last I heard he moved up north somewhere off the grid. No phone, no email. He was always a private guy." That didn't stop Ellie. If Henry was the key to saving Misha, she would find him. She started with the sanctuary's old records, flipping through digital archives and yellowed files from decades past. Newspaper clippings told the story of Misha's early years, rescued as a cub from a roadside attraction, malnourished and terrified, her spirit nearly broken. The articles all mentioned the same name, Ranger Henry Wallace. A grainy black and white photo showed a younger version of him, tall with kind eyes and weathered hands, standing beside a small frightened bear cub. Misha. Ellie exhaled slowly, her chest tightening. If Misha had bonded with Henry all those years ago, his sudden absence might have left a wound that had never fully healed. And now, in her old age, maybe she had finally decided she was done waiting for him to come back. Determined, Ellie widened her search. She typed Henry Wallace, retired ranger, into every database she could think of, scrolling through irrelevant results. Other men with the same name, old reports, obituaries that made her stomach lurch until she confirmed they weren't his. Then finally a lead. A small blog post from 5 years ago written by a nature photographer. It mentioned meeting a reclusive former ranger named Henry Wallace living in a cabin near the Canadian border. Ellie's heart pounded. She grabbed her phone and called Martin. "Hey," he answered groggily. It was past midnight. "Ellie? What's wrong?" "I think I found him." Martin was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Ellie, even if you did, what are you expecting? That he'll drop everything and come rushing back for an old bear?" She bristled. "He loved her, Martin. I've read the articles. I've seen the photos. If there's even a chance that seeing him could bring her back, isn't it worth trying?" Martin hesitated, then muttered, "You're too stubborn for your own good." "I'll take that as a yes." He exhaled, resigned. "Where is he?" "Up north. Near the border." Martin grunted. "That's a long shot, Ellie." "I don't care," she said, already packing a bag. "I'm going." The next morning, as Misha lay unmoving in her enclosure, Ellie climbed into her truck, started the engine and headed north. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew one thing for certain. He was running out of time. Ellie gripped the steering wheel tightly as her truck rumbled along the winding forest road. The air smelled of damp pine, and the early morning mist curled around the towering trees like ghosts reluctant to fade. She had driven for nearly 6 hours, fueled by coffee, determination, and the image of Misha lying motionless in her enclosure. Henry Wallace had to be out here somewhere. Her only real clue came from the blog post she had found the night before. The photographer had mentioned a man living in isolation near a lake, somewhere past a small unnamed town close to the border. But that wasn't much to go on. Ellie pulled into the town's only gas station, a dusty, weathered shack with a single fuel pump and an old man sitting outside, whittling a piece of wood. She rolled down her window. "Excuse me," she called. The man barely glanced up. She stepped out of the truck and approached him. "I'm looking for someone, an old ranger named Henry Wallace. Do you know him?" The man stopped whittling and squinted at her. "What do you want with Henry?" Her heart leapt. "You do know him?" The old man frowned. "Depends. He doesn't like visitors." Ellie exhaled sharply. "Please, it's important. It's about Misha." For the first time, the man's expression softened. He set his knife down on his lap. "The bear." Ellie nodded. She's not doing well. She stopped eating. She won't move. I think she's waiting for him." The man studied her, then sighed. "Henry don't take kindly to strangers, but if it's about that bear, he might listen." He gestured toward the mountains beyond the town. "Follow the dirt road past the ridge. You'll see a lake about 10 miles in. His cabin's tucked back in the trees. If he's still there, that's where you'll find him." Ellie's heart pounded. "Thank you." She climbed back into the truck and followed the directions, the road narrowing with every mile until it was barely more than a rugged trail. Birds scattered as her tires crunched over fallen leaves, and the scent of pine grew stronger. Then she saw it. A small, weathered cabin nestled between the trees, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Ellie parked and climbed out, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She hesitated, suddenly unsure. What if he refused to listen? What if he didn't care anymore? Well, she had come too far to turn back now. She stepped onto the creaky wooden porch and knocked firmly on the door. For a long moment, nothing. Then footsteps. Slow, measured. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, bearded man with piercing blue eyes and a face carved by time. Henry Wallace. He stared at her, wary. "Who are you?" Ellie took a deep breath. "My name's Ellie. I work at the sanctuary. It's Misha, she needs you." Henry's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A memory, maybe. Ellie pressed on. "She's not eating. She's shutting down. I think she's been waiting for you." Silence. Then Henry exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You should come inside," he said. Ellie's chest tightened with hope as she stepped over the threshold, knowing this was only the beginning. The cabin smelled of cedar and old paper, the air thick with the weight of solitude. Ellie stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the space. Simple wooden furniture, a cast-iron stove, and shelves lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Henry walked past her and sat down heavily in a worn-out armchair. He rubbed a hand over his face before finally looking at her. "You said Misha isn't eating?" His voice was rough, as if unused for long conversations. Ellie nodded. "It started about a week ago. He just stopped. She won't eat, barely drinks water. It's like she's given up." Henry exhaled, staring at the fire in the stove. His hands, rough and calloused from years in the wilderness, tightened into fists. "She's old," he muttered. "Maybe it's just her time." Ellie clenched her jaw. "I don't believe that." "Not yet." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I think she's been waiting for you, Henry." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Henry let out a slow breath, his eyes distant. "I was there when she first opened her eyes outside of a cage," he murmured. "She was just a cub, small, scared, and stubborn as hell. She shouldn't have trusted me, but she did." Ellie listened, sensing the memories unraveling inside him. "I raised her," Henry continued. "Fed her, taught her how to climb, how to hunt. She followed me everywhere. We spent years together before she was moved to the sanctuary. But I thought it was for the best." Ellie's voice softened. "Why did you leave?" Henry's jaw tightened. "Because I was getting old. I didn't think it would matter. She had people looking after her, younger people. I figured she'd forget me eventually." Ellie swallowed the lump in her throat. "She never did." Henry's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for the first time she saw something crack beneath the surface. Regret, guilt, maybe even pain. Ellie pulled out her phone and tapped on a video she had taken just a few weeks ago. It was of Misha, standing tall, her fur gleaming in the sun as she played in the water. Her strength was undeniable. She turned the screen toward Henry. This was her not long ago. She was still fighting. Still full of life, Ellie said. And now she just lays there, barely breathing. "You meant something to her, Henry. Maybe more than you ever realized." Henry stared at the screen, his face unreadable. Then he slowly stood. "How long will it take to get there?" he asked. Ellie's heart pounded with relief. "A day, maybe less." Henry nodded, grabbing his old Ranger jacket off the hook by the door. "Then what are we waiting for?" As Ellie followed him outside, watching the man who had once been Misha's whole world climb into her truck, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. The drive back to the sanctuary was quiet, the hum of the truck's engine the only sound between them. Henry stared out the window, his fingers drumming against his knee. Ellie could see the tension in his face. Worry, guilt, anticipation. He had spent years convincing himself that Misha had moved on without him. Now he was about to find out if she had been waiting all along. As they neared the sanctuary, Henry finally spoke. "What if it's too late?" Ellie tightened her grip on the wheel. "Then at least she'll know you came back for her." Henry exhaled and nodded, but she could tell the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. When they arrived, Ellie barely had time to park before Henry was out of the truck, striding toward Misha's enclosure. The other staff members turned in surprise, whispering among themselves as the old Ranger approached the fence. Ellie ran to catch up, her heart hammering as she saw Misha still curled in the same spot, her massive body rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. A plate of untouched food lay nearby, the fish now stiff and dry from exposure. Henry gripped the bars of the enclosure, his knuckles turning white. "Misha." No reaction. Ellie felt her stomach drop. She had hoped, prayed, that his presence alone would be enough to wake her. But the bear didn't even lift her head. Henry swallowed hard, then took a step closer. His voice, low and gravelly, softened in a way Ellie hadn't heard before. "Come on, girl. You gonna ignore me after all these years?" A flicker. Misha's ear twitched. Ellie held her breath. Henry crouched down, pressing his hands against the fence. "It's me, kid. I'm here. I'm sorry it took me so long." Misha's breathing hitched. Then slowly, painfully, she lifted her massive head. For the first time in weeks, her dull brown eyes sparked with something familiar. Recognition. Ellie's hands flew to her mouth as Misha let out a soft, rasping huff, the kind bears used to greet those they trusted. Henry smiled, his own eyes glistening. "Yeah," he murmured. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" The bear blinked slowly, her gaze locked onto him as if making sure he was real. Then inch by inch she pushed herself up onto her front paws. The other staff members gasped. Ellie felt tears burn her eyes as Misha took an unsteady step forward. Then another. She reached the fence and lowered her head, pressing her nose against the bars. Henry reached through, brushing his fingers gently against her fur. "There you are," he whispered. Then, in a moment that made Ellie's heart nearly burst, Misha turned toward the plate of food and took a bite. The sanctuary erupted in quiet murmurs of disbelief. Ellie let out a shaky laugh, wiping her eyes. Henry chuckled, his voice thick. "Guess you were just being stubborn, huh?" Misha huffed again and took another bite, chewing slowly. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. Ellie exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Misha wasn't gone yet. She had been waiting for him. And now finally he was here. The sun had just begun to set, casting golden light over the sanctuary as Misha finished the last scraps of her meal. Her movements were still slow, her body weakened from days of starvation, but there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. Life. Henry hadn't moved from his spot by the fence. He watched her with a quiet intensity, as if afraid that if he looked away she might slip back into the darkness. Ellie stood beside him, arms crossed over her chest, relief washing over her in waves. "You did it," she murmured. Henry let out a small, breathy chuckle. "I don't know if I did anything. She just needed to know I hadn't forgotten her." Ellie smiled. "She never forgot you either." Misha lay down near the fence, stretching out with a deep, rumbling sigh. She looked at Henry, eyes half-lidded, and huffed softly, a sound of comfort, of trust. Henry exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "She was my first rescue," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. I told myself she'd be better off without me. But seeing her like this..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Ellie placed a hand on his arm. "She never needed to forget you, Henry. She just needed to know you were still out there." Henry nodded slowly. After a long moment he turned to Ellie. "How long you been working here?" "5 years, she said. "Been here since I finished school." Henry studied her, then nodded approvingly. "You care about them." Ellie smiled. "Yeah. A lot." Henry looked back at Misha. The old bear blinked at him sleepily, the tension in her body finally melting away. "I think I should stay for a while," Henry said. Ellie grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next few days Misha grew stronger. She still moved slower than she once had, but her appetite returned, and she no longer curled into herself like a forgotten relic. And every morning without fail Henry was there by the fence, talking to her like he had all those years ago. One evening, as the sky turned shades of violet and orange, Henry sat on a bench outside her enclosure. Ellie joined him, watching as Misha lumbered toward the water for a drink. "You know," Henry mused, "I spent years thinking I'd never belong anywhere again. That I'd left everything that mattered behind." He glanced at Ellie. "But maybe I was wrong." Ellie smiled. "Welcome home, Henry." For the first time in a long time Henry Wallace let himself believe it. And as Misha rested peacefully under the fading light, it was clear she did too.